So a while back, I bought this original first generation iPhone from 2007 for $400 Australian or around $300 US, which is pretty typical for an iPhone 2G in this kind of condition. But this one has something up its sleeve worth turning your head for. After all this time, this iPhone 2G is still running its factory software, iPhone OS 1.0, meaning that in the 15 years of its existence, it's never been updated. Therefore, this device has the first ever user experience of the first ever iPhone that you'd have gotten on launch day in 2007. And not only is that special in itself to have sort of a time capsule, but this is also a pretty rare thing to find, especially at the price I got it. I mean, most other iPhone 2Gs for sale on 1.0, or even just in general, cost hundreds more, even thousands, especially if it's still sealed. Therefore, I got a steal of a bargain for this thing, but probably because it's not in mint condition, as you can see. And so, with that being said, in this video, I'm going to be going over each aspect of the very first version of iOS from a 2022 perspective, as well as the extent to which it is still usable, if any. So first off, obviously, early iOS is vastly different to what we have today, compared to the flat, colourful, and 2D design as of now. That was probably obvious from the get-go, but the first version of iOS has a lot of similarities and differences of today's iOS that are really interesting to look at. And so, let's start on the lock screen. Now, the form of security you got with the first iPhone was slide to unlock, which was a very iconic feature back in the day, especially on versions prior to the updated look of iOS 7. And who could forget that crispy, nostalgic sound it had when you unlocked the phone? Now, once we move on to the actual home screen, it's actually not as different to what we have now as you might expect. I mean, it's actually worlds of difference, but like, you've still got the same basic principle. Main apps at the bottom, and all the other ones in rows in the middle. But while it might look familiar, this version is just completely bare bones, as it lacks so many things that we just take for granted these days, every time we use our phones. To name a few, you can't move the apps around, you can't download apps since there was no App Store until the following year, you can't double press the home button to switch apps or close apps in the background, you can't use Siri since that didn't come out until 2011, there's no notification center or control center, and perhaps the most essential feature, you can't change the background photo on the home screen. So yeah, all things considered, it's a very watered down and basic experience compared to what we have now, but like, you also gotta put into perspective the fact that back in the early days of the iPhone, all people were concerned about was how you could navigate your smartphone just by touching it with your finger. And so adding in a feature where you could swipe down to see all your notifications wasn't really the most important of priorities. And all in all, it's really quite amazing to see how far we've come in terms of what our smartphones can do. And I'm sure that in 10 years time, we'll be complaining about how the iPhone 13 Pro Max from 2022 didn't even have mind control support or something. Now, even though iPhone OS 1.0 is only the very skeleton of modern iOS, it still packs in a few interesting quirks. For starters, it's got the old built-in YouTube app that came pre-installed with the phone, which hasn't worked for years and years now, but this phone running iPhone OS 1.0 has it, although unfortunately, it doesn't actually do anything, because it stopped receiving support yonks ago. And in addition to that, the camera app is just hilariously basic by modern day standards, and I mean hilariously basic to put it lightly. Literally all you get is a viewfinder and a shutter button, nothing else. No tap to focus, no flash, no video, no selfie camera, no portrait mode, and no ability to take photos using the volume buttons. Again, you get a viewfinder, you get a terrible camera, and you get a shutter button. That's all. And so, with my examination of the first version of iOS now out of the way, it's time to answer the question, how usable is it 15 years after its release? Well, I know this is probably going to come as a huge surprise, but not very much, beyond the very, and I mean very basic things. I mean, for one, you can't actually make calls or text or use data with it anymore, since 2G networks are as rare as hen's teeth nowadays, and that's the connection the iPhone 2G uses, hence the name 2G, which I guess isn't really a direct fault of the phone, but more so the discontinuation of 2G networks, and up until like 2017, you could actually still make calls with it. Plus, you can actually still operate it using Wi-Fi, and that allows for very, very bare bones web browsing, nothing that would be considered actually useful. You can still type stuff into Google and search for it, and view the results, and Google Images, but good luck actually trying to access any websites. Most sites just aren't compatible anymore with software this old. That's just the way the cookie crumbles with very old technology becoming obsolete. Although one thing that actually really blew me away was that the built-in Google Maps app actually still works. You can still scroll around and zoom wherever, although I couldn't get it to search for places or get directions, but apart from that, it still functions, and even has the modern look. So that's pretty darn impressive for 15-year-old mobile software. And on the other hand, you can still do a decent amount of things that don't require internet, like using the calculator, setting alarms and timers, writing down notes and setting reminders, and for that, well, it works just as well as it did in 2007. Obviously, I'm not saying at all that you should actually go out and use an iPhone 2G for these things, because it's extremely unpractical and expensive, but you theoretically could. Although again, please don't, it's just not a good idea. And so, all in all, this iPhone 2G running iOS 1.0 is a really interesting device to look at, especially on my end considering how darn cheap it was. Well, I mean, it wasn't cheap, but it was cheap for an iPhone 2G on iOS 1. Despite the first version of iOS feeling like it was probably used by cavemen, as well as its complete obsolescence today, this would have been the best mobile operating system in the world back in 2007. It's really interesting to think that people would actually use this back then and think it was the coolest, most advanced thing ever. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting in any way, please make sure you drop me a like and subscribe to TechSpree for more reviews, insights, and the occasional unboxing. Thank you so much for watching. This is Tom with TechSpree, and I'll see you as always next time.